The routine night patrol. The moon was high and coldly bright on a stretch of isolated road. Lieutenant Brad Thompson, a seasoned patrol officer, maneuvered his police cruiser through the empty streets, the silence only broken by the occasional rustling of trees or the distant call of a lone owl. Brad was a man of habit, and tonight was no different. Cruising through town on a route as familiar as the lines on his face, his mind drifting through thoughts as dark as the night around him. Years on the force had exposed Brad to countless incidents, some brutal and others harrowing. But something else had seeped in, something more insidious than a mere badge of hardened experience. Over time, his perspectives on certain people had twisted, shaped by unspoken biases he rarely acknowledged even to himself. He convinced himself it was just part of being vigilant, yet in moments of stillness, he could feel the tight coil of suspicion that lay in his gut. It was as much a part of him as his police belt. Ahead, on the shoulder of the road, a lone sedan sat idly with its headlights off. Brad slowed down, feeling his pulse quicken as he assessed the scene. A dark car in an isolated spot. Out of place, he thought immediately. A memory of a recent string of reported burglaries flashed through his mind, reinforcing his determination to inspect the vehicle. He switched on his flashing lights, casting a sudden red and blue glow over the still car. The beams sliced through the night, illuminating the sedan in harsh light. He parked directly behind it, exited his cruiser, and adjusted his holster out of habit. Brad approached the driver's window with purposeful steps, the night air tingling with the cold edge of autumn. His fingers instinctively brushed the handle of his gun, a reflex that had been deeply ingrained by years of perceived threats. As he approached, he could finally make out the driver, a tall, calm-looking black man who appeared unbothered by the sudden intrusion. The man sat relaxed, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, his hands resting calmly on the wheel as if he had anticipated this moment long before it happened. Brad's jaw tightened, a slight flicker of annoyance flaring as he reached the window. With a practiced flick, Brad signaled for the man to roll down the window. The driver, maintaining his composure, complied, lowering it smoothly, and meeting Brad's gaze with an air of quiet confidence. "License and registration," Brad ordered, his tone clipped and authoritative. It was the tone he reserved for people he'd already judged in his mind. The driver reached over to the glove compartment, moving with a deliberate calmness that almost unsettled Brad. There was no nervous fumbling, no anxious glances, just an air of composure. This man, who Brad would later learn was named Marcus Johnson, retrieved his documents and handed them over without a word. Brad examined the license, frowning at the name and address, processing the details in silence. Marcus Johnson. It didn't ring a bell, but that didn't change anything. Brad had decided, almost unconsciously, that this man didn't belong here. His bias clouded his judgment, casting Marcus's calm as an affront. "So, Mr. Johnson," Brad began, narrowing his eyes as he handed back the license, "what are you doing out here tonight?" "Just heading home from work," Marcus replied, his voice steady and unbothered. Brad studied him, feeling a prickling irritation. Marcus's calmness felt too deliberate, too composed for someone who had just been pulled over. "And where exactly do you work?" Brad prodded, his words laced with an edge of suspicion. Marcus met Brad's gaze, his dark eyes steady. "I work with the government." Brad's brows furrowed slightly, his irritation deepening. Something in Marcus's demeanor, cool, almost detached, rubbed him the wrong way. He sensed a challenge, subtle but unmistakable, hidden behind Marcus's calm expression. "You don't seem like you're from around here," Brad said, unable to mask the note of accusation. Marcus didn't react, his face a mask of composure. He answered in an even tone. "Born and raised in this state, officer. I'd say I'm just as local as anyone." The response only fueled Brad's frustration, his jaw tightening as he forced himself to maintain control. The quiet confidence Marcus exuded felt like defiance, challenging the authority Brad wore like armor. His hand twitched slightly toward his holster, his mind conjuring all the times he'd been taught that authority meant respect, and that disrespect required a response. "Why don't you step out of the vehicle?" Brad said, his voice dropping to a menacing tone. A brief flicker of something crossed Marcus's face, but he complied, opening the door and stepping out into the chill. He moved with an unhurried grace, his posture relaxed yet alert. In the glow of the cruiser's headlights, Brad got a better look at him. A tall man with an athletic build, looking every inch the confident professional. Brad squared his shoulders, raising himself to his full height. He aimed to reassert control, but Marcus's steady gaze held him in place. This man was not reacting as he'd anticipated. There was no sign of fear or defensiveness, just an unyielding calmness that felt unsettling in its intensity. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the quiet rustle of leaves stirred by the night wind. Brad cleared his throat, his voice gruff as he broke the silence. "I don't appreciate your attitude," he warned, leaning in closer. "I don't know who you think you are, but—" "Actually, officer, before we go any further," Marcus interjected, his voice calm yet firm, "there's something you need to know." Brad's brow furrowed, thrown off by the sudden interjection. The man's voice carried an authority he hadn't expected. For the first time that night, Brad hesitated, his mind racing as he sensed a shift in the dynamic between them. "Look, I don't care what you have to say," Brad began, but his words trailed off as Marcus reached into his back pocket, producing a sleek black leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing an ID badge that gleamed under the light. Brad felt the air leave his lungs, his pulse quickening as he read the words etched on the badge. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agent Marcus Johnson," Marcus said, his voice steady. The words hung in the air, slicing through Brad's assumptions with brutal precision. A tense silence settled between them, each man assessing the other. Brad's mind whirled, caught between disbelief and a gnawing realization of his mistake. He'd assumed so much, allowed his biases to warp his perception, and now he was face to face with a man whose authority outstripped his own. The gravity of his actions sank in, the weight of prejudice exposed under the sharp light of truth. Marcus waited, watching Brad with that same unflinching gaze, giving him a moment to process the reality of who he was. The quiet defiance Brad had mistaken for disrespect was now revealed as strength, a calm, steady strength that refused to be diminished. For the first time that night, Brad felt something other than anger, a flicker of shame, raw and uncomfortable. As he stood there, caught in the cold grip of his own actions, he realized that this encounter was about to change everything. And whether he was ready or not, the story was far from over. A clash of power and perspective. The quiet stillness of the night was shattered by the intense stare between the two men. A silent battle of will that illuminated far more than the flashing red and blue lights on Brad's cruiser. Lieutenant Brad Thompson's mind was spinning, struggling to reconcile the assumptions that had driven his every move with the reality that now confronted him. For Brad, this was supposed to have been just another routine night patrol, a simple check on a suspicious vehicle. But nothing about this encounter was going as expected. Here he was, face to face with a man who not only belonged to one of the most powerful investigative agencies in the country, but seemed utterly unfazed by Brad's authority. Marcus Johnson's FBI badge gleamed with a certain gravity that weighed heavily on the seasoned lieutenant, whose experiences had, up until now, taught him that his position granted him control over nearly every encounter. But tonight, that power felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Brad felt his jaw tighten, his fingers twitching by his holster as he wrestled with a sudden surge of conflicting emotions: anger, embarrassment, and a flicker of something he couldn't yet name. It was a feeling that crept up from a deep, rarely examined place within him, one that had long been fortified by years of assumptions and unchecked bias. But under the unwavering gaze of Marcus Johnson, that wall seemed to be cracking. Brad's breath felt shallow as he forced himself to address Marcus, hoping to reestablish his control over the situation. "So, Agent Johnson," he said, forcing authority into his voice. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" Marcus held Brad's gaze, his expression calm but pointed. "I already told you, Lieutenant. I'm on my way home from work." Brad's brows knitted together, his frustration flaring at the calm tone Marcus used, a tone that, to Brad, felt like a reminder of the mistake he had already made. "From work?" Brad echoed, his voice carrying an edge. "Last I checked, FBI agents don't typically hang out on lonely roads in the middle of the night." Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Law enforcement isn't a 9-to-5 job, Lieutenant. I'd think you of all people would know that." The words landed with the weight of an unspoken truth, one that subtly but effectively put Brad on notice. He felt the sting of Marcus's statement, not just because it was true, but because it implied something Brad wasn't ready to confront: his own misjudgment. For the first time in years, Brad felt his confidence waver, his internal narrative clashing with the man who stood before him. He wasn't used to feeling this way, this exposed. With a stubborn resolve to salvage some control over the situation, Brad leaned in, his posture authoritative. "Look," he said, his voice low, "I don't know who you think you are, but I have a job to do here. Just because you have an FBI badge doesn't mean you're above a routine check." Marcus took a deep breath, nodding slowly as he considered Brad's words. "No, Lieutenant," he replied calmly, "but it does mean I'm aware of the protocol. And unless you have a legitimate reason to hold me here, I suggest you let me continue on my way." Brad's heart pounded as he absorbed the quiet challenge in Marcus's words. His entire career had been built around a structured understanding of power, control, and authority. Yet here he was, feeling like the ground beneath him was shifting. Marcus wasn't backing down, and his calmness felt like a mirror held up to Brad's own actions, reflecting something uncomfortable, something Brad hadn't been willing to see before. "Listen," Brad said, his voice harder now. "I think you're forgetting who's in charge here. I stopped you, and that means I get to ask the questions." The silence that followed felt thick, heavy with the tension of their clashing egos and perspectives. Marcus let a moment pass before he replied, his voice as steady as ever. "You're right, Lieutenant. You do get to ask the questions, but here's one for you. What exactly do you think I've done wrong?" The question hung in the air, piercing the quiet like a blade. For Brad, it was a simple enough question, yet it cut deeper than he was prepared for. It was the kind of question that forced him to examine not just this encounter, but every decision, every assumption that had led him here tonight. He found himself at a loss for words, a rare occurrence that unsettled him further. Finally, Brad cleared his throat, his voice betraying a hint of hesitation. I mean, it's just protocol to check suspicious vehicles out here at this hour." "Suspicious vehicles," Marcus repeated, his tone challenging yet devoid of anger. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what made my car suspicious? The color? The fact that it's parked? Or was it just me sitting inside it?" Brad's face flushed at the unspoken implication in Marcus's question, his mind racing as he struggled to articulate a response that didn't expose his own biases. He hadn't anticipated being challenged like this, especially not by someone who spoke with such quiet authority. "Look, I was just doing my job," Brad muttered defensively, avoiding Marcus's gaze. Marcus nodded, his expression understanding but firm. "I get that, Lieutenant, and I respect the work you do. But there's a difference between doing your job and letting your assumptions drive your actions." The words struck a nerve, and Brad felt a flash of anger mixed with something far more unsettling, an acknowledgement that Marcus was right. In his years of service, he'd encountered countless people, made countless decisions in the name of duty. But this moment felt different. It felt like he was being forced to confront something about himself that he had long ignored, buried under layers of authority and a rigid belief in his own righteousness. The night air felt colder as he grappled with this unfamiliar feeling, his hand once again straying toward his holster, not out of need but out of habit, a need to ground himself in the familiarity of his uniform, his position. But the gesture didn't bring him the usual reassurance. Instead, It felt hollow, a reminder of the power he thought he wielded, but that was now slipping through his fingers. Marcus noticed the movement and offered a subtle but pointed reminder. "Lieutenant, I'm not a threat. I'm not here to challenge you or your authority. I'm just a man trying to get home after a long day." Brad's defenses wavered, his mind spinning with thoughts that were both foreign and uncomfortable. His silence stretched, the weight of Marcus's words settling over him like a heavy shroud. For the first time, he realized that he was the one on the defensive, that he was the one being held to account. Marcus took a step back, giving Brad space to process his own internal conflict. "I've met plenty of officers, Lieutenant. Some good, some not so good. But I also met a few who've let their uniform dictate their sense of right and wrong. I don't think you're one of those. But tonight, well, tonight, I'm not so sure." The words were soft, almost compassionate, yet they landed with a force that left Brad momentarily speechless. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He felt the sharp edge of Marcus's gaze, the quiet strength that didn't need to shout to be heard. And for the first time, Brad felt the weight of his own assumptions pressing down on him. "Let me ask you something, Lieutenant," Marcus continued, his tone still calm but now carrying a faint hint of sadness. "When you saw me sitting in that car, did you see a man, or did you see something else?" Brad's throat tightened as he fought to suppress a rush of emotions he couldn't fully name. He wanted to defend himself, to justify his actions, but he knew that any words he spoke now would only ring hollow. In that moment, he was forced to see the truth, a truth he had long ignored. He finally met Marcus's gaze, feeling the burn of shame settle deep within him. I'm not sure what I saw," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. Marcus gave a small nod, the faintest trace of empathy flickering across his face. "Then maybe it's time to look a little closer, Lieutenant. Maybe it's time to question the things you thought you knew." With those words, Marcus stepped back, his posture relaxed, but his gaze unwavering. Brad felt the sting of those words long after Marcus had spoken them, a quiet challenge that cut deeper than any reprimand he had ever received. The silence between them stretched once more, but it was no longer tense. It was the silence of realization, of something shifting between them. For the first time, Brad felt the weight of his own actions, a heaviness that settled over him like a shroud. He wasn't sure where to go from here, what to say to make things right. And as he watched Marcus return to his car, Brad knew that this night would leave a mark on him, a mark that would be hard to erase. The question wasn't whether he could confront his own bias. The question was whether he had the courage to change. The burden of reflection. The night air felt heavy, pressing against Lieutenant Brad Thompson as he stood beside his cruiser, watching Marcus's car fade into the darkness. For a few long minutes, he was motionless, rooted to the spot, his mind reeling from the encounter. Brad had faced angry drivers, belligerent suspects, and countless late-night altercations, yet nothing had left him feeling as exposed, as raw as this moment did. His hands instinctively moved toward his holster, grasping at a sense of authority he could no longer feel. It was as if his badge, the uniform, the years on the force, all the things that had defined him, now felt strangely hollow. He had been so certain, so unwavering in his belief that his duty meant keeping order, watching for suspicious behavior, maintaining a heightened vigilance. But Marcus Johnson's words echoed in his mind, unraveling that certainty thread by thread. "When you saw me sitting in that car, did you see a man, or did you see something else?" Brad's jaw clenched as the question dug deeper, forcing him to confront a truth he'd long buried beneath layers of conditioning, assumptions, and pride. As he looked around at the quiet, empty stretch of road, he couldn't escape the irony. He had spent years believing that patrolling these streets was his way of serving justice. And yet tonight, the real lesson in justice had come from a man he'd assumed was just another suspicious figure. He felt the chill in the air settle into his bones, a discomfort that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. With a weary sigh, Brad slid back into his cruiser and turned off the flashing lights. The dashboard glowed softly in the darkness, casting an almost surreal light on his face as he stared at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. The eyes that looked back at him were tired, lined with years of accumulated stress. But tonight, they held something else, a hint of regret, a flicker of doubt. Brad ran a hand over his face, the roughness of his stubble reminding him of the hours he'd spent on shift, believing he was upholding the law, protecting his town. He thought of the countless people he'd pulled over, questioned, and detained. People he had judged within seconds, based on nothing more than the color of their skin, the car they drove, or the neighborhood they were in. His mind drifted back to an encounter from years ago, one he had nearly forgotten until now. It had been a routine stop, a young black man driving an old, beat-up car through one of the more affluent neighborhoods. Brad remembered pulling him over, his suspicions already heightened before he even approached the window. The man had been polite, respectful, answering every question without a hint of attitude. And yet Brad had found himself pressing harder, looking for a reason to search the car, to justify the stop. In the end, he hadn't found anything, and the young man had driven off, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering wariness. Brad shook his head, feeling a pang of guilt as he recalled the subtle resentment in the man's eyes, the unspoken accusation that Brad had chosen to ignore. Back then, he had brushed it off, convinced that he was simply doing his job. But now he couldn't help but wonder how many of those stops had been based on his own assumptions rather than real evidence. How many lives had he disrupted simply because he hadn't been willing to question his own biases? His radio crackled, jolting him back to the present. He glanced down at it, but his hand hesitated before reaching out. He couldn't bring himself to engage, not yet. The weight of his thoughts felt too heavy, the reality too harsh to ignore. Brad turned the radio down, silencing the familiar static that had once been a comforting backdrop to his nights on patrol. Tonight, the silence felt like a reckoning, pressing in on him with a weight he hadn't anticipated. Brad's mind wandered back to his early days on the force, when he'd been filled with an almost naive sense of justice, eager to make a difference. He had idolized the officers he'd worked with, soaking up their advice, adopting their mannerisms. Many of them had spoken in hushed tones about knowing when someone was a threat, sensing danger based on little more than a gut feeling. He had believed them, taken their words to heart, letting their biases become his own. It had felt empowering, this sense of being able to read people, to predict their actions. But now he saw it for what it was, a dangerous assumption, a prejudice masquerading as instinct. For the first time in years, Brad felt a sense of disillusionment settling over him, a crack in the foundation he had built his career on. The image he had of himself as a protector, a guardian of the law, was fading, replaced by the uncomfortable truth of his own shortcomings. He wasn't just feeling regret for his encounter with Marcus. He was questioning his entire approach, his methods, his motives. The reflection in the rearview mirror shifted, and he caught a glimpse of his father's face in his mind's eye. His father had been a police officer too, a proud man who had taught Brad that honor and integrity were the pillars of their work. Brad could still remember the nights his father had come home, his uniform crisp, his demeanor one of quiet strength. He had been Brad's hero, the man who had inspired him to join the force. And yet, his father had also harbored certain beliefs, subtle but unmistakable, about people who looked different, came from different backgrounds. Brad had never questioned it, had accepted it as part of the job. But now, with Marcus's words echoing in his mind, Brad realized that he had a choice. He could continue down the path he'd always known, letting those biases shape his every decision. Or he could take this encounter as a lesson, a turning point, a chance to redefine what it meant to serve and protect. He sat in the cruiser, wrestling with the weight of that decision. A part of him recoiled at the thought of change, of admitting that he had been wrong. It was easier, safer, to hold on to his familiar beliefs, to brush off the encounter as an anomaly. But deep down, he knew that wasn't an option anymore. Marcus had forced him to confront a part of himself he had long ignored, and there was no turning back now. Finally, Brad took a deep breath, his hand reaching for the door handle. He stepped out of the cruiser, the cool night air grounding him as he looked around at the empty road. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the night settle over him, and made a silent vow. He would change. He didn't know how, didn't know what it would look like, but he knew he had to start somewhere. As he walked back to his cruiser, he pulled out his phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing a number he had memorized from years of training seminars and workshops. It was the number for a community relations officer, someone he had always seen as more of a formality, a box to check during annual training sessions. But tonight, that number represented something else, a step toward understanding, a chance to confront his own biases in a real, meaningful way. When the line picked up, Brad felt a flicker of apprehension, but he pushed through it, introducing himself with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. "This is Lieutenant Brad Thompson," he began, his voice steady despite the conflict churning within him. I'd like to talk about setting up a meeting, maybe some sessions on bias training for myself and my team." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a voice that held a note of surprise. "Of course, Lieutenant. We can make that happen." As he hung up, Brad felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. He knew that this was only the beginning, that confronting his own prejudices would be a long, difficult journey. But he also knew that he couldn't go back to the way things had been. Marcus Johnson had changed him, forced him to see the world through a lens he had long avoided, and for that, Brad realized, he was grateful. With a newfound sense of purpose, Brad sat back in his cruiser, letting the quiet of the night wash over him. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But he was ready to face them, ready to become the man he had always wanted to be, the man his father had taught him to be, and the man he knew Marcus deserved him to be. Confronting resistance, Brad Thompson awoke the next morning with a sense of unease gnawing at his gut, a reminder of the confrontation that had shattered his assumptions the night before. As he went about his morning routine, each mundane task felt charged, haunted by Agent Marcus Johnson's words and the quiet strength he'd shown under pressure. The encounter lingered in Brad's mind, its impact deeper than any reprimand he'd ever received. After his call to the community relations officer the night before, he had received a prompt email outlining the bias training sessions and a list of resources designed to broaden perspective and foster community understanding. As he read the words on his screen, Brad felt a surge of resistance. He'd joined the force to protect and serve, not to question himself. But there was no avoiding it now. He had taken the first step, and as much as he wanted to back out, something inside him knew he couldn't. The morning air was crisp as he arrived at the precinct, carrying a fresh sense of determination along with a lingering uncertainty. As he made his way down the familiar hallway, his boots echoing on the tile floor, he glanced around at the faces of his fellow officers, his colleagues, his friends. These were the people he had laughed with, confided in, shared stories of grueling shifts and close calls. Yet today, their conversations felt distant, foreign. The camaraderie that had once been comforting now felt like a barrier, a reminder of how much he'd absorbed from their collective attitudes and unspoken biases over the years. He approached his superior's office, feeling his heart pound with a mix of apprehension and resolve. Captain Sarah Gleason was a seasoned officer, a woman whose commanding presence had always been tempered by a deep respect for the law and an unwavering dedication to her officers. She had been Brad's mentor in many ways, guiding him through the early years of his career, shaping his approach to policing. Yet as he prepared to knock, he wondered how much of her teachings had also contributed to his narrow view. "Come in," she called, her voice muffled through the door. Brad opened the door, stepping inside and meeting her curious gaze. Captain Gleason sat at her desk, her expression unreadable, her steely blue eyes sharp as they scanned his face. "Lieutenant Thompson, what brings you in so early?" Taking a deep breath, Brad closed the door behind him, the weight of his decision settling heavily on his shoulders. "Captain, I'd like to discuss implementing some new training sessions," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. Captain Gleason's eyebrows raised slightly. "Training sessions. We just wrapped up the usual procedural reviews last month. What kind of sessions are you thinking?" "Bias training," Brad replied, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I think it's something we could all benefit from, starting with myself." A moment of silence passed, and Captain Gleason leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from curiosity to cautious understanding. "Bias training," she repeated, her voice carrying a note of skepticism. "Is there a specific incident that brought this to mind?" Brad hesitated, his mind flashing back to the night before. The harsh glow of his cruiser's lights, the look in Marcus's eyes, the stark realization that had followed. "There was an interaction I had recently. It made me realize that some of my actions, some of my assumptions, might be clouded by perspectives I haven't questioned in a long time." The captain regarded him carefully, her gaze sharp yet reflective. She tapped her fingers on the desk, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I see," she said finally. "Lieutenant, you've been with us for over a decade. Your record speaks for itself, and I know you to be a dedicated officer. But what exactly are you hoping to achieve with this training?" Brad took a breath, struggling to articulate the shift he felt within himself. "I want to make sure I'm doing this job right, Captain. I realized last night that, well, that I may not have been as objective as I thought. And if I've been carrying biases, I'm sure I'm not the only one." The captain's expression softened slightly, her demeanor less guarded. She nodded slowly, an acknowledgement that seemed to carry its own weight. "All right, Lieutenant, I'll consider it, but understand that not everyone will be as receptive as you. Bias training is a hard sell around here. A lot of the officers might see it as an insult, an implication that they're not already doing their jobs fairly." "I understand," Brad replied, his voice firm. "But I'm willing to take that risk." Captain Gleason studied him, her eyes searching his face for a hint of hesitation. When she found none, she nodded, her gaze steady. "Very well. Let's start small, just you and a few other senior officers. If it goes well, we'll talk about expanding it." Brad left her office with a sense of accomplishment, but as he walked back through the precinct, he couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that lingered. He had just taken the first step, but he knew this journey would be met with resistance, from both his colleagues and from parts of himself he had yet to confront. Over the following days, the bias training sessions were scheduled, and Brad found himself standing in a small conference room alongside 4 other officers, 3 men and 1 woman, all veterans with years of experience. Each one looked at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism, their postures guarded, their expressions unreadable. The facilitator, a tall, unassuming man named Mark Peters, introduced himself and began with a short speech about the purpose of the training. Brad watched the others, noting the way they crossed their arms or shifted in their seats, their expressions ranging from indifference to thinly veiled irritation. It was clear that no one was thrilled to be there. As the session continued, Mark led them through a series of exercises, each one designed to reveal the subtle biases that often go unnoticed. One exercise involved identifying implicit associations, using flashcards with words like dangerous, safe, trustworthy, and unreliable. Brad felt a surge of discomfort as he realized how often he had unconsciously linked certain descriptors with particular demographics. His face flushed as he acknowledged the truth he had tried so hard to avoid. He glanced at his colleagues, catching the faint grimace on Officer Jim Miller's face, the way Sergeant Lori Whitman shifted uncomfortably. They were all feeling it, that uncomfortable reckoning with beliefs they had never questioned. By the end of the first session, the room was filled with a strained silence. Mark closed his notebook, giving them a measured look. "This isn't easy," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Recognizing bias isn't about blaming anyone. It's about acknowledging that we all have perspectives shaped by our experiences. The question is whether we're willing to challenge those perspectives, to do better." The officers filed out of the room, their faces tense, their expressions guarded. Brad lingered, feeling the weight of their silent judgments. He could sense the growing tension, the way some of them avoided meeting his gaze. As he exited the room, Officer Miller approached him, his expression a mix of irritation and disbelief. "What's gotten into you, Thompson?" Miller asked, his tone sharp. "We've been doing this job for years, and now you're acting like we're the bad guys." Brad took a steadying breath, meeting Miller's challenging gaze. "I'm not saying we're the bad guys, Jim. I'm saying that maybe we've been seeing things in a certain way, and it's time to look closer." Miller scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "Sounds like you're drinking the Kool-Aid. Next thing you know, we'll be expected to apologize every time we make a stop." "It's not about that," Brad replied, fighting to keep his tone calm. "It's about making sure we're doing this job right, that we're not letting our assumptions cloud our judgment." Miller shook his head, muttering under his breath as he walked away. Brad watched him go, feeling the weight of his colleagues' skepticism press down on him. He knew he would face resistance, knew that changing a deeply ingrained culture was a task fraught with challenges. But as he walked through the precinct, feeling the eyes of his fellow officers on him, he held on to the memory of Marcus's calm, unflinching gaze, the strength in his voice as he had challenged Brad to question his own actions. Brad knew that this journey would be long, that it would push him to confront parts of himself he had long avoided. But he was ready. He had seen a truth he couldn't ignore, a truth that demanded change. And for the first time, he felt a quiet, steady resolve, a determination to become the officer he had always aspired to be. With each step, he reminded himself of his commitment to the truth, to the values he had sworn to uphold. And as he walked back into the precinct, he knew that the real challenge had only just begun. The weight of change. The precinct's air felt colder, tenser, as Brad walked through its familiar halls in the days following the first bias training session. What he once considered a haven, filled with camaraderie and shared purpose, now felt distant, and at times hostile. The shift was subtle at first, a few side glances, quiet conversations that fell silent when he approached. But as the training continued and Brad openly supported it, the distance between him and his colleagues grew more apparent. The ripple effects of the training sessions were starting to show, and Brad knew that his decision to confront his biases was not going to make him popular. He caught snatches of conversations in the break room, discussions where his name was often muttered with disdain. "Thompson's gone soft," he heard Officer Miller say one morning, his tone mocking. "Next thing you know, we'll be asking criminals if they'd like tea and cookies." Brad didn't react, choosing instead to pour his coffee and leave the room, his stomach twisted into knots. The words stung, not because he wanted his colleagues' approval, but because he had once shared their mindset, their beliefs. He saw himself reflected in them, in the very behaviors he now sought to change. This quiet resistance, this resentment, it was his past self staring back at him, and it left him unsettled. A few days later, Captain Gleason called him into her office. She sat behind her desk, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Lieutenant Thompson," she began, her voice firm, "I want to address something that's been causing tension around here." Brad nodded, his shoulders tense. He knew what was coming. "Is this about the training, Captain?" "Yes," she replied, her gaze steady. "There's been some pushback. The officers, well, they're not used to this approach. They see it as an unnecessary change, something that challenges their ability to do their jobs. You're a senior officer, Brad. Your decision to support this training has made an impact, but not all of it positive." Brad took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settle over him. He respected Captain Gleason. She had taught him much of what he knew. But this was a change he knew was necessary, regardless of the discomfort it caused. "Captain, I know it's not easy, but I can't ignore the things I've realized. If we're here to protect and serve, then we owe it to ourselves and the community to confront our biases. Ignoring them only leads to more harm." Captain Gleason leaned back, crossing her arms. I understand, Brad. But there's a difference between acknowledging bias and making it the focal point of our operations. The officers feel like they're being scrutinized, as if the entire department's integrity is being questioned. Brad met her gaze, a flicker of frustration in his eyes. Maybe it should be, he said, his voice steady. I've spent years walking around with blinders on, and I didn't even know it. What I thought was vigilance was actually prejudice. That night with Agent Johnson, it opened my eyes. I know some of the officers see it as an insult, but if we don't address these issues, we're failing in our duty to this community. The captain sighed, studying him closely. You've changed, Brad. I remember when you were the one laughing at these sessions. Brushing them off is just another requirement. Now you're pushing for something that's making you a target among your own team. I know, he replied, his voice calm. But I'd rather be a target than keep pretending we don't have a problem. Captain Gleason regarded him for a moment before nodding. All right, Brad. I won't stand in your way, but know that this isn't a battle you can fight alone. You're going to need allies, and right now, you don't have many. The warning was clear, and as Brad left her office, he felt the weight of her words. She was right. The rift between him and his team was growing, and without support, his efforts to change the culture within the precinct would falter. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. A few days later, he decided to take a step that would bring him face to face with the community he served. He had spent so many years patrolling these streets, enforcing laws, responding to emergencies. Yet, in all that time, he had rarely taken the opportunity to listen to the people who lived here, to hear their concerns. He realized now that his role as a protector meant more than just reacting to crime. It meant building trust, understanding the very community he had sworn to protect. Brad arrived at the local community center that evening, where a weekly open forum was held for residents to voice concerns and discuss issues with law enforcement representatives. The center was a modest building, a worn but welcoming place that had seen years of gatherings, protests, celebrations. As he stepped inside, he felt a flicker of apprehension. He was accustomed to the controlled environment of the precinct, but here he was entering a space that demanded vulnerability. The room was filled with people of all ages, backgrounds, faces both familiar and unfamiliar. The atmosphere was charged, a mixture of tension and anticipation as the meeting began. A community organizer named Maria stood at the front, addressing the crowd with a calm but powerful presence. Tonight, we have Lieutenant Thompson with us, she announced, her gaze sweeping over the attendees before settling on Brad. He's here to listen to your concerns, to understand the experiences you've had with law enforcement. As Brad took his seat at the front of the room, he felt the eyes of the community on him, a weight that pressed down on him like a physical force. For the first time, he felt exposed, stripped of the authority his uniform usually granted him. Here, he was just a man facing the consequences of a system he had once blindly upheld. The first person to speak was an elderly woman named Ruth, someone Brad had seen around town but never spoken to. Her voice was steady, but her words were laced with years of frustration. I've lived in this town my whole life, she began, her voice firm, and I've seen officers stop my grandchildren, my neighbors, for no reason other than the color of their skin. We're told that it's for our safety, but I don't feel safe when my family is targeted. How do you expect us to trust you when you see us as suspects before you see us as people? Her words hit Brad like a blow, each one exposing a truth he had never truly faced. He looked into her eyes, seeing the pain, the anger, the exhaustion of someone who had endured a lifetime of prejudice. He wanted to respond, to offer an apology, but he knew that words would be meaningless without action. One by one, community members spoke, each story a painful reminder of the reality he had ignored for so long. A father spoke of his teenage son, who had been stopped 3 times in a single week for matching a description. A young woman recounted an experience with an officer who had dismissed her concerns, making her feel invisible and devalued. Each voice was a thread, weaving a tapestry of mistrust, of experiences that had fractured the relationship between the community and the officers who were meant to protect them. By the time the last person had spoken, Brad felt the weight of their stories settle heavily over him. He realized that his journey of change wasn't just about confronting his biases. It was about earning back the trust of the very people he had failed. He took a deep breath, standing up to address the crowd. "I want to thank each of you for sharing your stories," he began, his voice steady but filled with humility. "I know that words aren't enough to heal the hurt caused by years of mistrust. I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing how we approach policing in this community." The room was silent, a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope in the faces before him. "This is a journey I'm just beginning," Brad continued, meeting their gazes with a resolve that came from deep within. "I know it won't be easy, and I know there's a lot to make up for. But I promise you, I'm here to listen, to learn, and to work toward building the trust we should have had all along." As he finished, he felt a wave of emotion swell within him, a quiet determination that replaced the apprehension he had felt earlier. The road ahead was daunting, filled with resistance both from within the force and from the community. But as he looked at the faces in the room, he knew that he couldn't turn back. This was his path now, one he would walk not just for himself, but for every person he had once dismissed, every voice he had silenced in his own mind. As the meeting concluded and the attendees filed out, a few approached him, offering quiet words of encouragement, tentative nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a fragile, hopeful beginning that he would fight to protect and nurture. When he left the community center that night, the weight he felt was no longer one of guilt, but of responsibility. A responsibility he was ready to carry, no matter the cost. The road to redemption. In the weeks following the community forum, Brad Thompson felt as if he were living two lives. By day, he was still Lieutenant Thompson, the badge-wearing, protocol-following officer his team had known for over a decade. But each evening, he found himself drawn back to the community, the faces and voices from that night at the center replaying in his mind. Their stories had lodged deep within him, reshaping his view of the world and of himself. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Brad got a call from Ruth, the elderly woman from the forum who had spoken of her grandchildren being targeted by police. Her voice was steady, but there was an urgency in her words. "Lieutenant Thompson, there's been an incident. My grandson, Jamal, was stopped by an officer today while he was walking home. He's scared, and so am I." Brad's pulse quickened, a mix of anger and shame surging through him. "Ruth, I'll be there as soon as I can," he promised, grabbing his coat and keys. As he left the precinct, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, their judgment palpable, but he pushed it aside. This was more important. When he arrived at Ruth's house, he found Jamal sitting on the porch, his shoulders hunched, a defensive look on his face. The boy was only 16, but his eyes held a wariness that made him seem older. Ruth sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. She gave Brad a cautious nod, her expression guarded but hopeful. "Jamal," Brad said, approaching slowly, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I'm Lieutenant Thompson. Your grandmother told me what happened." Jamal's gaze flickered to Ruth, then back to Brad. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I was just walking home. The officer said I looked out of place." Brad felt a wave of anger, both at the officer and at himself. He remembered all too well how he had once justified similar stops, believing he was simply doing his job. But now, faced with the fear and defiance in Jamal's eyes, he saw those actions for what they were, a violation of trust, an abuse of power. "I believe you, Jamal," Brad said, his tone sincere. "And I'm sorry you had to go through that. You shouldn't have been treated that way." One by one, community members spoke, each story a painful reminder of the reality he had ignored for so long. A father spoke of his teenage son, who had been stopped 3 times in a single week for matching a description. A young woman recounted an experience with an officer who had dismissed her concerns, making her feel invisible and devalued. Each voice was a thread, weaving a tapestry of mistrust, of experiences that had fractured the relationship between the community and the officers who were meant to protect them. By the time the last person had spoken, Brad felt the weight of their stories settle heavily over him. He realized that his journey of change wasn't just about confronting his biases. It was about earning back the trust of the very people he had failed. He took a deep breath, standing up to address the crowd. "I want to thank each of you for sharing your stories," he began, his voice steady but filled with humility. "I know that words aren't enough to heal the hurt caused by years of mistrust. I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing how we approach policing in this community." The room was silent, a mixture of skepticism and cautious hope in the faces before him. "This is a journey I'm just beginning," Brad continued, meeting their gazes with a resolve that came from deep within. "I know it won't be easy, and I know there's a lot to make up for. But I promise you, I'm here to listen, to learn, and to work toward building the trust we should have had all along." As he finished, he felt a wave of emotion swell within him, a quiet determination that replaced the apprehension he had felt earlier. The road ahead was daunting, filled with resistance both from within the force and from the community. But as he looked at the faces in the room, he knew that he couldn't turn back. This was his path now, one he would walk not just for himself, but for every person he had once dismissed, every voice he had silenced in his own mind. As the meeting concluded and the attendees filed out, a few approached him, offering quiet words of encouragement, tentative nods of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a fragile, hopeful beginning that he would fight to protect and nurture. When he left the community center that night, the weight he felt was no longer one of guilt, but of responsibility. A responsibility he was ready to carry, no matter the cost. The road to redemption. In the weeks following the community forum, Brad Thompson felt as if he were living 2 lives. By day, he was still Lieutenant Thompson, the badge-wearing, protocol-following officer his team had known for over a decade. But each evening, he found himself drawn back to the community, the faces and voices from that night at the center replaying in his mind. Their stories had lodged deep within him, reshaping his view of the world and of himself. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon when Brad got a call from Ruth, the elderly woman from the forum who had spoken of her grandchildren being targeted by police. Her voice was steady, but there was an urgency in her words. "Lieutenant Thompson, there's been an incident. My grandson, Jamal, was stopped by an officer today while he was walking home. He's scared, and so am I." Brad's pulse quickened, a mix of anger and shame surging through him. "Ruth, I'll be there as soon as I can," he promised, grabbing his coat and keys. As he left the precinct, he felt the eyes of his colleagues on him, their judgment palpable, but he pushed it aside. This was more important. When he arrived at Ruth's house, he found Jamal sitting on the porch, his shoulders hunched, a defensive look on his face. The boy was only 16, but his eyes held a wariness that made him seem older. Ruth sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. She gave Brad a cautious nod, her expression guarded but hopeful. "Jamal," Brad said, approaching slowly, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I'm Lieutenant Thompson. Your grandmother told me what happened." Jamal's gaze flickered to Ruth, then back to Brad. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I was just walking home. The officer said I looked out of place." Brad felt a wave of anger, both at the officer and at himself. He remembered all too well how he had once justified similar stops, believing he was simply doing his job. But now, faced with the fear and defiance in Jamal's eyes, he saw those actions for what they were, a violation of trust, an abuse of power. "I believe you, Jamal," Brad said, his tone sincere. "And I'm sorry you had to go through that." You shouldn't have been treated that way. Jamal's expression softened slightly, though skepticism still lingered. You say that now, but how do I know things will change? Brad looked at Ruth, her face lined with worry and hope, before turning back to Jamal. You're right. Words aren't enough, he admitted, his voice low but resolute. But I promise you, I'm committed to changing how we approach situations like this. I'll be speaking to the officer who stopped you, and I'll make sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. Ruth placed a comforting hand on Jamal's shoulder. Lieutenant, I appreciate you coming here, she said softly. But it's going to take more than one apology to fix what's been broken. Brad nodded, feeling the weight of her words. I know, Ruth. And I'm here to listen, to learn, and to take action. That's my promise. After he left Ruth's house, Brad went directly to the precinct. His mind was racing as he walked down the halls, each step bringing him closer to the officer who had stopped Jamal. When he found him, Officer Daniel Price, sitting at his desk, Brad's anger simmered beneath his calm exterior. Officer Price, he said, keeping his voice steady, I need a word with you. Price looked up, his face a mixture of confusion and defensiveness. Sure, Lieutenant. What's this about? It's about Jamal Thompson. You stopped him this afternoon, Brad replied, watching Price's expression closely. Price's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of defiance flashing across his face. I was just doing my job, Lieutenant. He looked like he didn't belong in that neighborhood. Brad felt a surge of frustration, but forced himself to remain calm. Jamal Thompson lives there, officer. That's his neighborhood. He has every right to walk home without being harassed. Price shrugged, his posture relaxed, dismissive. Look, it's not my fault if he looked suspicious. I was just following my instincts. Brad's voice hardened. Your instincts, or your biases? Price shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms. With all due respect, Lieutenant, you've been doing this job as long as I have. You know we have to trust our gut out there. Brad took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. Yes, but our gut isn't infallible, officer. It's influenced by what we've learned, by the assumptions we've absorbed. And those assumptions don't belong in our work. I don't want to hear about another incident like this. If you're not sure whether someone belongs in a neighborhood, remember that we serve all people, not just the ones who look like us. The tension between them was thick, a silent standoff. Price opened his mouth to argue, but something in Brad's gaze silenced him. After a long moment, he looked away, muttering a begrudging acknowledgement. The encounter left Brad feeling drained but resolute. He knew there would be pushback, that people like Price would resist every change he tried to implement. But he was no longer willing to let fear or discomfort deter him. He had seen too much, learned too much, to turn back now. Over the next few weeks, Brad began organizing meetings with community leaders, seeking ways to foster communication and build trust. He met with pastors, business owners, school principals, anyone who could help him bridge the gap between the precinct and the people it served. Each conversation was humbling, a reminder of the work that lay ahead. Many of them were skeptical, wary of yet another promise from law enforcement, but Brad accepted their doubt, understanding it as the natural result of years of broken trust. One evening, he was sitting in the community center, discussing future initiatives with Maria, the community organizer he had met at the forum. Maria was sharp, a woman whose quiet strength had earned her respect from both the community and her peers. Lieutenant Thompson, she said, her tone measured, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this won't be easy. The community's pain runs deep. People are angry, hurt. It's going to take more than a few meetings to heal that. Brad nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. I understand, Maria. I don't expect things to change overnight, but I'm committed to doing whatever it takes. She studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. Why the change, Lieutenant? You've been on the force for years. Why now? Brad hesitated, remembering that night on the lonely road. The way Marcus Johnson's calm gaze had stripped away his defenses. "Because I saw what I didn't want to see," he admitted, his voice low. "I realized that my actions, my beliefs, were hurting people. And I don't want to be that kind of officer anymore." Maria's expression softened slightly, a flicker of respect in her eyes. "Then let's get to work." As they discussed plans for community events, workshops, and open forums, Brad felt a quiet sense of purpose settle within him. He was finally doing what he should have been doing all along, serving the people, not just enforcing the law. In the following months, he faced resistance from within the precinct. Officers like Price continued to question his motives, accusing him of betraying the Brotherhood. Some refused to participate in the bias training sessions, their resentment simmering just beneath the surface. But Brad held his ground, refusing to let their resistance deter him. Slowly, he began to see small shifts. A few officers opening up during training, a handful of community members attending the precinct's outreach events. One afternoon, as he was leaving the community center after a meeting, he saw Jamal standing by the door. The teenager met his gaze, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. Brad approached him, offering a tentative smile. "Hey, Jamal. How are you?" Jamal shrugged, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Fine, I guess." Brad nodded, sensing the boy's hesitation. "I know things have been tough, but I want you to know that I'm here. If you ever need anything, or if you just want to talk, I'm around." Jamal looked up, his expression softening. "Thanks," he said quietly. After a moment he added, "My grandma says you're trying to change things. I hope you mean it." Brad felt a surge of determination, his voice steady as he replied, "I do, Jamal. I won't stop until this is a place where everyone feels safe, where everyone is respected." Jamal nodded, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Then maybe things can get better." As Brad watched him walk away, he felt the weight of his journey ahead, a journey fraught with challenges, with resistance and setbacks. But in that moment, he knew that he had made the right choice, that every step he took was a step toward redemption. He turned and looked back at the community center, a modest building that had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of the change he was determined to bring. And as he walked away, he felt a quiet strength settle within him, a strength rooted in humility, in the promise he had made not only to the community but to himself. The road to redemption was long, but for the first time, Brad knew that he was finally on the right path.